Welcome. You are listening to Caregiving Secrets with Deborah Greenhut. If you are a family caregiver or expect to be one, and you want to maintain your well-being while caring, then you are in the right place. I am your host, Deborah Greenhut, speaker, author, and rational caregiver advocate. I'm a family caregiving veteran, bringing you survival secrets and experiences from experts who share the goal of doing less by managing more. We need to invent and reinvent family care, and together we're going to do it. My big idea is rational caregiving, and my motto is let your brain lead your heart. Please share yours in the comments. Caregiving Secrets, because friends don't let friends be caregivers alone. Let's do this. Welcome, everyone, to the Caregiving Secret. I'm very happy today to have with me as my guest Jill Rosenthal, Dr. Jill Rosenthal, who is an award-winning Harvard and Stanford educated physician and best-selling author who retired after a 35-year career and became certified as a mindset coach. Her extensive experience, and training, coupled with her own transformation from a stressed, overworked, unhealthy physician, wife, and mother into a healthy, thriving coach, make her uniquely equipped to help others release unconscious thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that hold them back so they can create their dream life. I welcome you, Dr. Jill Rosenthal. You have had caregiving at just about every end of this Trump thing and that it is. So I'm sure you have a lot that you'd like to share with us today. Where would you like to
Yeah,
begin?
I mean, obviously, my whole career has been caregiving. And the medical part of it, I was paid for, although not always, commensurate with what I was doing. Um, but what we're here today talking about is the unpaid caregiving, which is what happened to me as a wife. And um, I did participate in medical caregiving stuff for my parents from across the country. They lived in New York for several years, long distance and commuting. Um, but it was different because they were completely, both of them completely with it until the very end. The more challenging caregiving for me has been my husband's dementia. And we've been doing that for about 15 and a half years now. So, which is a long time. It was all of my 50s, and I'll be 66 next week and a half. So it's big chunk of my life. Today is our 25th wedding anniversary, and uh, he doesn't know who I am anymore. So I have to be the one celebrating that. Um, and when we met in 1993. So we met more than 31 years ago. And somehow, even as a physician who had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's, it never occurred to me. My husband's 27 and a half years older than me. It somehow never occurred to me that like that would be what would happen. Like I sort of figured with that age difference, unless something really bad happened to me, probably, he would go first. Um, but I figured it would be something medical that we could deal with together as a team. And somehow, we have blinders. It never occurred to me somehow that it would be something where we couldn't fight it together necessarily, and that in fact it might, there might be some crunchy adversarial times even. And um and then it happened. And I think like many people in this situation, like you want it to go away. You want it to be something other than what it is. And if you get stuck there, then you find yourself in a world of hurt and suffering and pain and anger and resentment and, a whole lot of other stuff that doesn't feel very good. And so figuring out how to climb out of that hole rather than keep digging is the secret to successful caregiving.
Wow, that is a breathtaking story, of what happens to our expectations and how dementia just short circuits everything.
Yeah, expectations. I have worked with a productivity coach who says expectations are resentment waiting to happen. And, um,
Hmm.
everything we do is about managing expectations. And so, as a caregiver, if you expect the person you're taking care of to be able to do something that they can't, you're setting yourself up for trouble. You know, we don't expect 4-year-olds to do calculus, right? We don't get mad at 4-year-olds if they can't do calculus. Um, but it's very easy to get frustrated when your spouse asks you, you know, 45 times in 5 minutes, what's for dinner? And, you know, we all know, we all know the dogma, don't say, don't you remember? Or I already told you, or, any one of 100 things that like, don't do that. But getting yourself to not do that is hard.
Much easier said than done. Yes.
It's easier said than done. And there's so much, I think there are a couple of experiences that I had that were pivotal in my learning to accept um, kind of what was happening. And I'll tell you first the one that was kind of the earlier one, and I wasn't all the way to acceptance yet. But, um, we had this shared calendar in the phones for the family. And one day, my husband, and this was quite, I mean, it was probably might have been 8 or 9 years ago. So, I mean, like, it was like when I think back to where we were then and where we are now, but um, we had one of these things that we always called convergence days, where there were multiple conflicting events on the calendar. And he had this idea that, if we set up rides for him, that he could go to the first one for a while and then leave it and get to the second one for a while and leave it and get to the third one. And, clearly that was not going to work. He was going to have to pick what he was going to go to. And, what ensued was from start to finish, probably 2 hours worth of like, he'd be like, okay, he'd agree. And then he'd look at the phone again and he'd be like, oh, but. And eventually I realized that I was going to have to put my big girl pants on and I was going to have to do something that felt really foreign to me. And I was going to have to make him pick which thing. And then I was going to have to actually remove the other two things from the calendar on his behalf. And it was the first time I'd had to do that. And it was, I felt like, I was taking away his agency. It felt terrible doing that. But ultimately, I realized that it was a kindness because otherwise, this calendar was just going to be tormenting him. He was just going to see it over and over and over again. And that it was, it was my responsibility to do that for him. And as a caregiver, when you have to sort of pick up more and more responsibilities that you never thought you'd have to do, and things you don't want to do, it's hard. Um, but the real flip the switch, like mind blown moment came for me 4 years ago. And we were in the kitchen. He had been in assisted living, but I took him home for 13 months during COVID. And so this happened in November of 2020. And I'm standing at the sink, and he's at the kitchen table. And he asks me for the first time who I was. And I'm like, oh, we're really in it now. There is no turning back. Like, this is it. And at that moment, like all frustration, no anger, no, no resentment. Like, you can't, how are you going to be angry at somebody for something they don't even know or can't remember that they did? And so, like, that moment for me was like, I just had to accept where we were. And that meant I had to accept him as he was, where he was, shifting every day, honestly, but like not, I couldn't hold on to what I wanted back. I wanted my life back, but I couldn't have it. It's like you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? And so that to me, that moment was the thing that took something hard and made it a lot easier.
That's a very powerful perception. I think when I talk with people and try to help them sort out their day to day in a caregiving situation, the thing that comes up so often is the guilt of having to make choices that you never in a million years would have made, or you made promises that you would not do that, such as putting someone into a facility, and reconciling that grief with the reality that's very clear in front of you that things are not going to be the same, and the staircase is always going away now, going downhill. And
Yeah,
I
there's a lot of grief. And um, the in the summer of 2018, I took a course. It was like a 6-week program for caregivers. And they gave us this wonderful book. Um, and I've forgotten the name, and it's in the other room. And if I go out there, the cats will come in here.
we
But
can put it we
but
can put it in the
one
show
of
notes.
the
So.
but one of the things that really, like, again, one of these light bulb moments was they talked about the difference between guilt and regret. And, I felt guilty. This was about 4 months maybe after he had first gone to assisted living. Now he's in memory care. But, um, and it talked about guilt as being like, if you do something that you know is wrong, if you do something bad and you feel bad about it, that's guilt.
Mhm.
If you're doing the best you can under the circumstances, and it's just that you wish it were otherwise, that's regret. And I realized that, when he went to assisted living, it was because I couldn't take care of him here. I couldn't give him as rich an environment. In assisted living, he had 5 activities a day. He had the gym every day. He had people to talk to as opposed to just, you know, lying on the bed and, fiddling with his phone. So I realized that, like, I could do better for him
Mhm.
by having him go into assisted living than I could do for him at home. And did I wish that it weren't that way? Yeah.
Could I ask you, since you have been a physician, and I know my parents, my dad was a doctor and my mother was a nurse, and it was always assumed that because they were those careers, they had those careers, that they must be able to adapt to healthcare situations. And I can tell you on the side of things that if one of us, my brother or I, got sick, my parents went to pieces. So they still did the things they were supposed to do, but the whole time they were nervous and worried and upset. And I did not go into any of those fields. And I think it may have been because I just saw the pain of being torn because you couldn't figure it out. So I'm going to ask you, does it help to be a physician in this case in any way?
Um,
Or maybe not.
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Certainly, when you're a physician and a family member is sick, um, it can be scary knowing all the possibilities, right?
Mhm.
Like, especially like when your kid is sick, right? And you think about like what we call the differential diagnosis, like the list of things that could be going on. That's not fun sometimes. On the other hand, sometimes it's very, you're like, okay, this is all that's happening. Um, as a physician, caregiver for my husband, it did help me to be able to advocate for him and push a bit, in terms of, care and stuff like that. But um, it's not like you shouldn't have to do that, right? You shouldn't have to fight for your care. And so, but I don't think in terms of the dementia caregiving, it was as big a deal. Now, when my parents had medical illnesses and were in the hospital, being a physician, and even true with my husband too, like, when you can have the conversation in a third of the time if you can use the lingo, right? If you understand each other, you can communicate in a different way and understand things in a different way. And in that sense, it's an advantage. Um, but I don't think I'm not somebody I've never really been somebody who tends to panic or fall apart. So it, I guess that a lot of that just depends on your personality.
Mhm. Well, there's a lot of training probably that goes into it in many cases too, although some doctors probably will panic and fall apart at times, especially with their own children. But
Yeah.
I mean, I saw my parents operate in very professional, almost ruthless ways when they were being a doctor and a nurse, and then they would come home and be someone else. I never knew how they made that transition, but I would guess if it's your own spouse, your own partner, your own love, that it's very difficult to keep
It,
your eye
it
on both of those things at the same time.
that's true. I mean, certainly when I was at work, you know, I had the patience of a saint,
Mhm.
right? Because you have to. And I mean, this is true anyway. I mean, anybody you're at work, you have a certain, like, you behave one way, and when you go home and it's your family and you're like, you care about them, it's like a different story. But even like if I was dealing with a dementia patient, and I was a dermatologist, but I had, a lot of my patients were older. But even so, I could be taking care of somebody who was, severely affected by dementia, and maybe they were even like kicking me or hitting me or something. And you wish it wasn't happening, but it's still, it's not your family member. It's brief. It might be a 20-minute visit that's taking 40 minutes or an hour, but like at the end of it, you get to go home. And then when you go home and you're dealing with that in your partner who you care about in a very different, I mean, I loved my patients, I cared about my patients, but
It's
it's
different
not my
stuff.
family, right? And so when you go home and your family member is doing all of this, it's a lot harder to be as patient. And that's the thing that changed for me that day standing at the sink, where like all of a sudden there's no frustration, there's no resentment, there's no anger, it's just now I have the patience of a saint at home too.
Mhm.
And um, the being able to accept where you are and surrender to it doesn't mean surrender's not giving up, it's just accepting where you are, right? Is the secret to thriving no matter what life throws at you. It's the thing that gets you through this. A lot of people would hear, I told you, my story, right? Like a lot of people would run screaming from the room if they heard that story, and yet I'm thriving. I've reinvented who I am and what my life is, um, and in order to do that, you can't be holding your hand on the hot stove.
No, that's a
You
great
got to take your
message.
hand off the hot stove in order to be able to take any kind of effective action. And so if we insist on staying in the narrative, if we insist on staying in the problem, then we cannot get to the solution.
Right, how you describe the problem is going to affect the solution that you're picking, and if you can't see it clearly, you're going to make some mistakes in
Yeah.
formulating the solution for sure. So one of the things that I advocate is rational caregiving. And I don't mean being a cold person at all, but I do mean you've got to set love aside and accept what is really there. So I'm so glad that you were able to tell us that story today because it really helps to see that that's the thing, the moment that you can see clearly that things are not going to be different because you want them to be different. There's no
Yeah.
way to wish this away or change it. That is the moment when you can start making those good decisions and see the problem.
Yeah. And also realizing that, especially with dementia, I think, because of the decline,
Mhm.
you're kind of dealing with a different situation potentially every day. And so, like, what there was a time when I really wanted my husband to eat as healthily as he could. And, especially like when I had him home for 13 months during COVID. And, he really was too far, his brain was too far gone at that point for it to make much of a difference. And then eventually, I'll skip the long parts of the story, but he's been in memory care for it'll be 3 years in February. And um, he at this point, like whatever he wants to eat, great. Like he's eating something, and he likes sweet things. So like he eats drinks a lot of Ensure and if he wants dessert first, I mean, you're 93 and a half years old. You're living, you don't remember 2 seconds ago and can't think 2 seconds in the future. Like, eat what you want, man, right? And so, like, you have to be, you have to be adaptable,
Mhm. Yeah, to
right? You
choose
have to
choose your
realize,
priorities
like,
well.
this made sense before, but it doesn't make any sense anymore. And then, you have to, and so being able to, you have to be able to set aside your own expectations and think about what this person needs, what they would have wanted. And hopefully, if it's a spouse, you've had those discussions, or a parent, anybody, you've had those discussions. But being able to set aside what you wish it could be and just kind of let it be what it is important. And it's hard. It takes practice, and it takes doing a lot of inner work. And you talked before, we mentioned mindset. There's mindset, like we think of cognitive, under rational, right? Reframing and telling yourself stuff. And sometimes that's enough, but really you have to really shift your mindset. You have to shift the emotions. You have to do the inner stuff. And a lot of people, that's hard to do on your own. And most people need some help with that.
Yeah, so you recommend consulting a therapist or someone who.
Therapist or a coach, or and there's all sorts of things. I mean, support groups are
Mhm,
great. I went to caregiver support groups until everything fell apart with COVID.
mhm,
Um, and it was great because, like, you had sympathy, you had empathy, you had people who got it. You had people, you could tell the story, people would tell the stories, and everybody, like, you could laugh because everybody, and the stuff, everybody else, if you told somebody else, they'd be like, what the hell's the matter with you? But like, when you're in it, like, you understand that,
mhm.
you can see the humor, and you're in this group. Um, but even so, like, that's really useful, I think, for caregivers. But sometimes that environment is keeping you in the problem,
Mhm.
right? It's
Yeah,
keeping you, like, you're kind of in this echo chamber
right.
of hearing that. And so sometimes having some additional professional support that's geared, like, just on you without the other person's filter can be helpful as well.
Yeah, I think to be able to redirect and not get locked into a rut of simply ruminating about it and thinking it over and over
Yeah.
and over the same thing is important, because while the person you're caring for may be stuck in one reality that's constantly changing, but that's a different reality, you need to be able to move on and look forward and see what's coming so that you can plan for it and also protect yourself from.
Yeah, and it's hard to plan, like, because you don't always know what's coming. Like, you think one thing's going to happen and
The
something
whole
else
day.
happens. And
Yeah.
um, it, but you have to learn how to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, other people can be helpful. I will agree with you, and at the same time, time is sometimes a factor for people. How do I get free to even sit at a Zoom table and converse with people in a support group like that? There isn't always a minute free to do it if you're on your own. So.
Yeah. When at the time that I was going to support groups, at first there was, in the same building, there was a support group for the caregivers, and in another room there was a support group for the early stage memory loss
Mhm.
patients. And so that worked.
Mhm.
And then eventually he moved into assisted living, and I can't quite remember. Maybe I picked him up and took him. I don't remember. And then COVID happened and it all disappeared. And at that point, he was beyond, and once he was in assisted living, I could come and go as I needed to, although, the phone, I get a lot of phone calls from, not from him really so much anymore, although every now and then there'll be a rash of calls during the night. But from the care staff, and all of that. But it's just, you know, it's part of it. And uh, I just have to be able to be open to what's happening. And I don't know what's going to happen. I
And
don't know whether he has 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years. He's 93 and a half. His sister lived to be 98 and a half, also end stage dementia. I don't know.
right.
Um, and what I do know is that, like, although I'm emotional, he's at the point now where I'm intellectually accepting of it and intellectually ready. I don't think you can ever be completely emotionally ready. It's going to be, it's going to be rotten when it happens.
Mm.
And um, and I have to be okay. I can't control that. There are so many things I can't control, and I have to just be like, can't control that.
Yeah, let it go.
Not worth worrying about it. Let it go.
Yeah.
And having had, um, the double whammy of dementia caregiving and having had cancer, when you have a life-threatening illness, you sort of have this, at the same time, like, I'm not going to let little stuff bother me, but I also don't have to make room in my life. Like, I can let it go, but it doesn't have to be just that it's there and it doesn't bother me. It's like, bye bye. And so, um, that's a lesson that makes more sense to people who have had a life-threatening illness. And so I can take that and bring that into caregiving, right? I can't control what he eats. I can't at this point, he's kind of getting a bushy beard because, he doesn't want to let them shave him. And it's like, you got to pick your battles, right?
Exactly.
Changing diapers, important. Beard,
Mm-mm.
not
No,
so much.
no.
And so, um, I think as caregivers, we have to sort of just learn that lesson, and it's a hard lesson.
I wish that we had more time to talk about it today, but we've come to the end of our podcast moment. But I think that is a great way to think about it as we leave today, that some things you cannot control, and it's best that you move on to the things that you can. And I know that's the serenity prayer as well.
Yeah,
And probably that's a big piece of what caregivers need to master in order to do the hard job that they have to do.
yeah. A friend of mine wrote a book called Serenity and Caregiving, actually. Another
Good
coach.
to know. Well,
So,
we're going to
yeah.
put some of your links in these show notes. Is there a place that people could reach out to you for?
Yes. They can find me. My website is drjillrosenthal.com. And I have a gift for your audience if they would like to get it. And it's called Letting Go of Anger in Dementia Caregiving, The Path to Acceptance and Connection. And they can find that at drjillgift.com/caregiving.
That's wonderful. I know that so many people are going to benefit from this. I so appreciate talking with you today. I've learned a lot about mindset and about thinking of things a little bit differently. And I hope that we're able to continue this conversation in some way, because all of us are going to have to be caregivers in one way or another. And I think the best way is if we share these ideas so that we can.
Yeah, I want to hear more about your story. We talked so much about my story today. I want to know how you got to be where you are sometimes. So it would be great to chat again sometime.
Thanks so much. We will certainly do that. And to our listeners, please remember, caregiving is best done as a group activity, not as a solo act. So reach out for whatever resources you can find and keep that serenity, keep that acceptance, because you are somebody, you do contribute, and it's such important work. And yet you also must take that time for self-care. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on the Caregiving Secret: How to Survive Family Caregiving. I love sharing these insights and stories to empower you on your caregiving journey. If today's conversation resonated with you, consider diving deeper by picking up a copy of my pamphlet, Non-Negotiables for Caregivers. It's filled with great strategies to help you think through how to maintain your well-being while caregiving. Nobody wants to become Carezilla, right? Visit sharegiving.net to get this resource that can help you navigate your caregiver path with grace and resilience. Let's continue to share our stories and support each other. Until next time, keep sharing, keep caring, and remember, you're not alone on this journey. Thank you.